I'm looking around, working in Unit 19 this week, and I can't help but notice how every single nurse is a travel nurse. That was the first day this week. The second day this week, looking around, there's all new nurses and travel nurses, which means that the travel nurses are running Unit 19 as well. Third day this week, I look around and we finally have a hospital staff who's able to be the charge nurse. And I can't help but notice how this is becoming more and more common as a travel nurse. Hi there, my name's Travel Nurse Gary. And what I want to talk about today is what the factors that are causing traditional staff nurses to leave their jobs to come do travel nursing, and what I'm referring to as the American travel nurse boom. First up, some background information on me. I'm an American travel nurse. I've practiced legally as an RN in 6 U.S. states. I've worked with COVID patients in 4 different U.S. states: California, New York, Louisiana, and currently I'm practicing as an RN in Maricopa County, which is in Arizona, Phoenix area. So the second piece of background information I want to update you on is understanding that I'm not an economist. I do love reading about the economies, and I've been studying it for about 10 years now. Recently, I've been reading about 2 books a month since this pandemic started. It really helps me cope with the stressors of my job. So one of the things that we do on this channel is always do a book recommendation. The book I'm reading right now is by Ray Dalio, who's Bridgewater Associates. He's an American billionaire. He really does a great job of explaining U.S.-Chinese relationships currently, and think this is a great book, and I want to recommend it for you to read. So the last piece of background information that I want to convey is that I'm really trying to write this and present it in a way that is a neutral tone so that you can learn from this overall experience, and that it doesn't matter who you are. If you're Jay Powell, you can learn something from this and maybe have a deeper understanding, but at the same time, by the end of this video, nursing administration in British Columbia can take this, and by the end of the video, look up CPI and their local economy and have a deeper understanding of nursing economics. Alright, you guys, you're probably not as excited as I am right now, because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite economists ever. The first economics book I ever really read was on Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, and we need to go to Scotland for this. 1776, there he is. That's what he looks like. What we need to know about for the free market capitalization is what we call this capitalism, and that's what really dominates the U.S. healthcare system. So when we take a look at healthcare right now and we see nursing, we have to understand what is causing these surplus issues, and we have to talk about something called supply and demand. And when I talk to nurses about this, nurses don't understand supply and demand. We don't take any economics courses. So when we talk about nursing economics, we have to really start at the beginning and talk about Adam Smith and how supply and demand works. So when we talk about supply and demand, we're going to talk about probably one of the oldest analogies that we can really relate this to, and that is blacksmithing. And we have supply and demand, and let's take a blacksmith from, say, ancient Babylon. And in Babylon, we have, let's say we have a blacksmith who makes the best shields. He makes 40 shields a year. He makes 40 shields year 1, and what happens is that there's other blacksmiths who are making shields, and so there's a huge supply of shields. And what happens is that the market has all this surplus of shields, and with all these extra shields, when he goes to sell his, he can't really get what he wants, and he has to really sell those for minimal profits. Minimal profits means that he really suffers, and his family have a really hard time paying his bills. Now let's take that exact same blacksmith and say Babylon the year afterwards, and they go to war. And there is a huge demand for those shields. So the demand changes the overall cost of those shields, in that the next year, because they go to war, and something he has no control over, causes those shields to go up in value. And the next year, his country's in war and he thrives. that's a supply and demand, but there's different factors that can really change these events too. Let's say a supply issue that applies to this situation in nursing right now. Same exact blacksmith, he makes 40 shields, makes the best ones, and let's say that his competitors all get sick and die. He's the only one on the market who has those shields. The demand is the same, but the supply goes down. So those prices go up, and one year he's completely really just able to get by, but then because all his other competitors go out of business, the supply goes down. So supply and demand controls the market value, and this is in a direct relationship of what's going on in the current market value for nurses. And we can really call this what it is. We can say contract nursing, travel nursing. A better label for it would be free market nursing right now, and that's a really great term for what's going on in the market right now. Is that we're free market nursing. So when we compare staff nurses to free market nurses, there's a couple different variables that we have to look at that have caused this transition, and we need to talk about. Let's go back to 2020, actually, to the beginning of the pandemic. So we had a low supply of nurses and like kind of an equilibrium with demand prior to the pandemic of 2020. And what we saw during 2020 is that we had lots of nurses with comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, and maybe perhaps their age played a factor in retirement, early retirement. So we've seen a supply of nurses go from short to really low, so a decrease in the supply of nurses at the beginning of this pandemic, and we've seen a huge demand for nurses. So when we looked at the free market nurses, there was a very limited supply at the time, and in order to compete for this valuable resource, this hospital put in insanely high price increases for these travel nurses. And these high wages caused more nurses to go into the travel nurse industry, and this started the transitioning from staff nurse jobs to the free market nursing. So when we look at the current market of nursing resource, we see a market that is still critically low. And as we have new nurses coming into the market, we see an output of about that same amount of people. We have to really include in this is staff nursing jobs and what they're facing, because when we look at their job, they're getting about between 2 and 4% annual raises, and we look at CPI, or the inflation, is that we see an inflation of 6.8%, and we see staff nurses gaining 2 to 4% annually. And so when you take 2 to 4% minus 6.8%, you're really looking at a 2.8 to 4.8% annual decrease in purchasing power. So staff nurses are losing purchasing power annually, while the free market nursing is double, tripling wages. And the free market really controls wages, and we have to look at the hospitals and say you have to compete in order to balance out this inequilibrium. We've heard about student loans in the market across pretty much every field in the U.S., but when we start talking about student loans now in the market, when you're down here in Unit 19 and you see these rates really high in paying for these nurses that cost a lot of money, we have to talk about student loans. And we start talking to these younger nurses, and you ask them why they're here, and well, they have $50,000 of debt most of the time. And so student debt just keeps on piling up, and we see the cost of education continuing up. Well, that cost is finally getting passed on to the hospitals that really have to pay for this now. That's what we're seeing, and we see a lot of these nurses, like, they're coming in and they're from other parts of the country going to the high-paying contracts because they got to pay off that student debt. All right, you guys, now let's do a real quick recap to help simplify all that information into a short segment. 1. At the beginning of the pandemic, a decrease in the supply of nursing that was caused by nurses retiring with advanced age and comorbidities leaving the field resulted in a decrease in the supply of nursing. 2. The pandemic caused an increase in nursing demand. 3. Inflation. It's really simple. Nurses got an annual increase of 2 to 4%. Inflation outpaced at 6.8%. That resulted in a decrease in overall purchasing power for nurses who were staff, as opposed to travel nursing where they could go and hit the free market and double or triple their wages. 4. Student debt. You really have to talk about student debt moving forward in the field of nursing because it is really impacting those new nurses when they come out. $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 of debt. Somebody's got to pay for it. Now, this isn't all the factors that are really contributing to the travel nurse boom, but I really feel like these are the major ones that are contributing. Don't agree with me? You're actually allowed to disagree with me on my own show. That's okay. Leave your comments or your concerns, questions down below. Would love to hear what you have to say. In addition to that, if you'd like to see more videos, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot of future episodes coming up for you on the Everything Travel Nurse Show. And if you thought that this was valuable content, please hit that like button so it lets other people know that this was valuable content. That's all we've got for you here.